Hello and welcome to this official side event at the 31st session of UNODC's Commission on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice, taking place this week in Vienna. On behalf of the Stop Ecocide Foundation, I'd like to thank our co-hosts Socialist International Women and co-sponsors Climate Council, Global Witness, Earth League International, Criminologists Without Borders and the NGO Committee on Sustainable Development here in Vienna. It's wonderful to work with you all. It is now my great privilege to introduce our esteemed chair and moderator for today, Justice Antonia Benjamin. Professor Antonio Herman Benjamin is a Justice of the National High Court of Brazil and President of the Global Judicial Institute on the Environment. He is Chair Emeritus of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law, a Knight of the French Légion d'Honneur, and a Commander of the Order of King Leopold of Belgium. He is also the recipient of the 2015 Elizabeth Hobb Prize for Environmental Law, awarded by Stockholm University and considered the most prestigious international distinction conferred upon an environmental legal expert. He's a Goodwill Ambassador for Environmental Justice of the Organization of American States, and in a rare botanical honor, Brazilian scientists have named a newly discovered species of orchid from the Amazon rainforest after him, Bulbophyllum Antonio Benjamini. Professor Benjamin, I hand over to you for opening remarks and the chairing of this event.
Many thanks. It's a great pleasure to chair this amazing panel. I have the pleasure to introduce each one of our panelists in a second. But before I do that, I would like to say first that when we discuss ecocide, in addition to all the environmental aspects involved, we are basically discussing the role of criminal law in society. And asking the fundamental question, what are the values that criminal law has to protect in a civilized world? We all know that criminal law is considered the last resort, and legislators and judges are very careful, or should be very careful, in designing criminal offenses. The big question is, if we criminalize homicide, killing another human being, should we criminalize those that destroy, attack, endanger the foundations of life? Those that are perpetrators of reckless actions, intentional many times, against the foundations of life. So let's not miss this ethical component in our discussion today. There are so many technical issues to be debated that sometimes we lose the broader perspective, in this case, the ethical perspective that we are dealing with. The second point that I'd like to emphasize, and this is very dear to me, is that although we discuss more recently ecocide from a transnational perspective, we should not forget that the same concept should apply in domestic, national, and subnational legislation. The concept is the same, the values are the same, only the jurisdiction framework would vary in this case. So whatever we discuss here today should be transplanted to a more localized debate within states on how to redesign crimes against the environment along the same lines. Finally, what about us judges? As we all know, many times, crimes against the environment are not prosecuted, and there is, of course, no conviction, and the judicial system is blamed for that. But many, many times, it's the legal system that should be blamed for impunity. for letting things go. It's a duty of the legal system to revise itself along the lines of the need to criminalize ecocide. Again, the foundations of life. Many times we judges are responsible for a lack of implementation or adequate implementation. But other times it is a failure, a complete failure of the legal system. And I'm sure the panelists will be discussing this in their comments. The first speaker is Joshi Mehta. Joshi is the co-founder of Stop Ecocide International in 2017, alongside legal pioneer, the late Polly Higgins. And I saw Polly and Joshi so many times, like Don Quixotes in or Doña Quixotes in events, knocking on doors, grabbing people, saying, look, this is important, listen to us. I am very proud of the work that you both have done along those years. And I've seen it, I watch it with my own eyes. So they activate and developed a global cross-sector support for an international crime of ecocide. As the organization's executive director and key spokesperson, Joshi has overseen the remarkable growth from nothing or almost nothing. And I was a member of the legal experts group of the UN in the 90s that drafts sort of model code on crimes against the environment. We never thought about ecocide. We spent hours discussing whether it would be environmental crimes or crimes against the environment. Just to give you an idea of how revolutionary and now almost taken for granted this concept is. She is the chair of the charitable Stop Ecocide Foundation, hosting us today, and convener of the independent expert panel for the legal definition of ecocide. Joshi, pleasure to listen to you.
Thank you so much. Crimes affecting the environment are now ranked 4th largest criminal activity in the world, on a par with drug trafficking in terms of how lucrative they are. And yet law enforcement in this sector remains extremely low, as Professor Benjamin remarked. Meanwhile, the severe environmental collateral damage of industrial activity, much of which breaches existing regulation, continues with impunity. We'd suggest that this situation results inevitably from the deeply ingrained mindset we have in our dominant Western systems, a mindset developed over centuries, a mindset of separating ourselves from the living world upon which we depend for our food, our water, the air we breathe. We simply take these things for granted and treat them as an infinite bank of resources, continuing to inflict levels of destruction which will directly affect our ability to survive and thrive on our planetary home. We all know you can't apply for a license to kill people for your new business. It would be both criminal and criminally insane. But we don't recoil in the same way from destroying nature, and we should, for very practical reasons. Removal of carbon sinks and keystone species, for example, via deforestation, poaching, and trafficking, as well as severe soil, water, and atmospheric pollution, all exacerbate ecosystem collapse and climate change. The warnings in international reports are becoming ever more stark as scientists attempt with increasing urgency to alert policymakers to these accelerating crises. We need to cultivate a new, healthy taboo around seriously damaging the natural living world if we are to protect the ecosystems that allow us to thrive, and criminal law has the capacity to do that. Making ecocide, severe and either widespread or long-term harm to nature, a crime, can provide the legal guardrail to steer us back from the precipice by setting a clear outer boundary to deter, prevent, and sanction the very worst harms. Because there is a clear gap here. If you advocate around human rights, at least you know that the worst violations, torture, forced displacement, mass murder, are recognized as deeply serious crimes. There is a deep moral and legal foundation to your advocacy at the global level. That foundational piece is conspicuously missing in the environmental arena, and it's a gap which is rapidly becoming a chasm into which vulnerable and vital ecosystems and communities dependent upon them are already falling. Recognizing ecocide as an international crime alongside war crimes and genocide has the potential to fill that gap, strengthening and shoring up existing laws addressing organized crime as well as civil regulation pertaining to environmental protection, while at the same time shifting norms to recognize the simple fact of humanity's dependence upon healthy ecosystems for our own survival. We could think of it as a criminal law health and safety framework for the planet and for ourselves. And not only that, putting this kind of outer boundary framework in place also serves to stimulate strategic change in the right direction, something that has hitherto been proving very difficult. We are witnessing a rising frustration at all levels with the failure to actually implement the multilateral environmental agreements and pledges which already exist. We human beings are creatures of habit, and industrial practice tends not to change without a change in the rules, particularly when fiduciary duties lead corporate decision makers to prioritize profit as a matter of obligation. The correct criminal law parameters can act as a kind of creative constraint, provoking the urgent new thinking and innovation we already know is needed. All of this helps to explain the growing demand for international recognition of ecocide, now coming from voices as diverse as the global youth movement, whose primary demand at the upcoming Stockholm +50 meeting is for an international crime of ecocide, and on the other hand, the global investment community. The International Corporate Governance Network, an investor-led network of banks and financial firms responsible for over half the world's managed assets, recently recommended governments to collaborate on criminalizing ecocide. An important milestone was reached last year when an independent panel of legal experts from around the world, convened by our foundation, reached consensus on a legal definition of ecocide as a proposed international crime in 2021. The core text is short and balanced. Ecocide means unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. This definition has gained significant political traction around the world. While the European Law Institute is working on a related EU-specific definition, and ecocide is also being discussed in the context of revising the EU Environmental Crime Directive. Individual states are also considering recognition of ecocide. Indeed, conversation around it is now on public record at parliamentary and/or government level in no fewer than 21 states which are parties to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Our organization continues to work to develop global cross-sector support for this recognition at all levels, from grassroots to NGOs, from policymakers to the private sector, and of course, at UN level in the context of the UNFCCC, the CBD, UNEA, and more. The Commission on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice is, of course, a key and deeply appropriate forum for this discussion, as we shall hear in various ways from the other speakers today. Recognition of this new deterrent to crimes affecting the environment is, we believe, only a matter of time before it's in place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jojo, for this panorama. As you mentioned habits, I would like to stress that habits should be understood as involving action. We continue acting as always. But the worst type of habit is by omission. We decide not to act because we have never acted. And I think this applies to ecocide. The next speaker is Andrea Krosta, Executive Director, Earth League International. Andrea has over 30 years of experience in conservation projects around the world. And in a parallel professional career, he has been working for over 17 years as an international consultant to companies and governmental agencies on high-end security technologies and service, homeland security, anti-piracy, investigations, and risk management. He now applies this unique knowledge to conservation and wildlife protection. He is the founder of Earth League International, among the founding members of the Wildlife Justice Commission in the Netherlands, and a member of the board of the Africa Conservancy Foundation, and the creator and project manager of WildLeaks, the world's first wildlife crime whistleblower initiative. Andrea, a pleasure.
Thank you very much. I will share my screen if it's possible. I think it is perfect. To make my speech a little less, a little more interesting. Thank you very much to the organizer for this opportunity to UNODC. Of course, it's a great pleasure to present with such a distinguished panelist. I'd like to talk about the importance of researching and investigating convergence in the context of ecocide and the work on the criminalization of ecocide. So to make it a real deterrent for bad actors, criminal organizations, corrupt government officials, international traffickers, corporations, financial institutions that usually don't get scared or deter very easily. I think in order to add a fifth crime to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court and make these bad actors liable to criminal prosecution, we need to enhance the way we research, investigate, and explain ecocide. And convergence can help exactly to do this, especially regarding environmental crime that, as Joshi reminded, is the fourth largest criminal enterprise in the world. Of course, ecocides includes much more than what we usually consider environmental crime, from plastic pollution to oil drilling and palm oil production and agricultural pollution. But I think that the way we are starting to use convergence to fight environmental crime could inspire and maybe give ideas and interesting inputs to the organization and stakeholders that are working to make ecocides the fifth crime in the Roma Statute of the ICC. So what is convergence? According to UNODC and Interpol, environmental crime is reported to converge or overlap with human smuggling, human trafficking, counterfeiting, drug trafficking, cybercrime, financial crime, arms trafficking, and terrorism. Transnational criminal networks such as organized crime groups, wildlife, seafood, timber traffickers, drug traffickers, at times share convergent points, places, businesses, interests, and people. In many parts of the world, various criminal groups operate in the same space, and to varying degrees, those groups overlap and even reinforce each other. These groups are involved in illegal logging, illegal fishing, wildlife crime at the same time, but also money laundering, human smuggling, all kinds of relations with local and international TOC, transnational organized crime. They also have relations with corrupt government officials, embassies, and even corporations and financial institutions. Traditional lines of separations are, in my opinion, no longer appropriate and enough for understanding and dealing with these issues. So based on the information that our organization collect firsthand and in our fields operations on dozens of international trafficking networks and some of the most important wildlife traffickers and environmental criminals in the world, we define and institute and analyze a suite of 4 convergent types. First of all, species convergence, meaning it refers to networks that traffic multiple species at the same time. For example, the same network can offer you rhino horn, pangolin, jaguar, and shark fins at the same time, even from different continents. The second kind of convergence, we call it environmental crime convergence, meaning involve the same networks engaging in wildlife crime plus the trafficking of other natural resources such as illegal logging, illegal mining, and illegal fishing. The third kind is very important. We call it serious crime convergence. So the same networks and actors engaging in other serious crimes such as human smuggling, money laundering, and drug trafficking. And finally, networks convergence describes the overlap of transnational organized criminal networks and their activities. Network convergence is multi-level, as these criminal networks have intentionally created a variety of regional, interregional, and transnational points of connection to strengthen their criminal activities. Unfortunately, although the concept of convergence, when we talk about so-called traditional organized crime activities, has long been established, there is a great gap, including information gap, regarding environmental crime and the convergence with other crimes. To better explain what convergence is and what kind of research of work is required, I'd like to share with you how my organization, Earthling International, works in this space and on this issue. Our work is about understanding environmental crime and convergence through an evidence-based approach that involves the acquisition of videos and audios and documents and all kind of evidence regarding illegal wildlife, natural resources, supply chains, including identify high-level traffickers, middlemen, and persons of interest. First of all, we address the who. So who are the most important players? We collect all kind of information and data about these individuals and networks, how they operate, how they move money. We collect information on everything they do illegally and legally, because the overlapping of legal and illegal activities is a key element to understand and research those networks. We analyze the information, the data in various ways, and then we disseminate this knowledge to relevant law enforcement and governmental authorities through our confidential intelligence brief, providing them with evidence related to convergence, degree, and scope in order to give government agency not only a better understanding of environmental crime and its main players, but also more angles and points to investigate these networks. So let me give you a couple of examples of environmental crime networks that we have been researching and investigating for the past years, because we tend to stay with our targets for a long time. This one is a great example. We call it SA1 network, operating from Suriname and Guyana to the rest of the world. Lots of species convergence, as you can see, a lot of sharks and seafood, but I also into jaguar parts and live animals. At the same time, big environmental crime convergence. They make money from illegal fishing, illegal mining. They reinvest money into illegal logging. Serious crime convergence as well. According to our information, they're able to launder $500,000 a day, and we have evidence of that. And then big network convergence with other organizations, including very dangerous organizations in Latin America, como Primero Comando de Capital and Chinese Mafia and Venezuela Mafia. So it's a great example of what is convergence. This is another network, we call it SA8, operating from Peru to the rest of the world. Lots of convergence, species convergence. We assess with biologists that this network alone is responsible for the poaching of almost 500,000 sharks every year. They also into jaguar, and they were able to offer to our team rhino horn from South America. So they are in contact with each other globally. Very big and serious crime convergence, especially money laundering. According to the information we got from them, they launder more than $70 million every year. And the same, again, network convergence all over the world with other networks. So, but this is an example of convergence coming from the same network in Latin America: rhino horn, jaguar, seahorse, shark fins, and a lot of money laundering. Working on ecocide is a very complex matter. It touches so many aspects of our life, present and future, of course, important global issues, and it requires multiple expertise from different fields. So I don't pretend, absolutely not pretend to be an expert. All I can say, based on our work in the field, that I think is convergence, a convergence-based approach backed by solid research and investigations can help to raise the bar of the conversation and help the efforts to make ecocide the fifth crime at the ICC. Also important and connected to convergence, in my opinion, is to research and prove with evidence that in many cases we are dealing actually with global organized crime forces that threaten our own existence and well-being, especially of local communities, so not only ecosystems. Of course, ecocide is not always about transnational organized crime, it's much wider and deeper, but it's an important building block of the work around ecocides and includes, of course, the link between transnational organized crime, the private sector, and governments. In fact, the reality, in many cases, is what we have been calling environmental crime for decades is, in fact, transnational organized crime, of course, with serious environmental implications. So there is also an issue of narrative. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Andrea. Krosta, as we all know, it's not enough to establish new criminal provisions. They need to be implemented. So what Andrea has just covered, coming from the more abstract panorama that Jojo gave us as an opening statement, is in real life, is in good investigation, good prosecutors, good judges. And by good, I mean those that have the evidence to produce good, proper evidence and are knowledgeable about those issues. Andrea focused more on convergence on the perpetrator side, but we could think of convergence on the good guy side. So on the institutions and the people that deal with this time of highly sophisticated criminality. Judges, prosecutors, investigators, on and on, but including the civil society as well. The next speaker is Sima Joshi, Director of Campaigns for Global Witness. And I had the privilege a few years ago to publicize, to launch the Global Witness report on environmental defenders in Rio de Janeiro, a major work. But this is for another event. Sima is, as you know, part of Global Witness, and not-for-profit focused on holding abusive actors to account, and in the climate emergency and breakdown of democratic space, the rule of law. She has over 20 years of professional experience working globally. She's a human rights lawyer and specialist focusing on confronting corporate crime, advancing environmental justice, and ending abuse in global supply chains, and has previously worked for Amnesty International as well as the United Nations. A great pleasure, Sim.
Thank you very much, and it's a real pleasure to join this panel today. And thank you very much to Jojo for all the excellent work that she is doing in leading this this movement. And I call it a movement because it seems to me that in the circles that I travel in, everybody is speaking about ecocide and excited about the opportunities that it provides. And thank you very much for that introduction. I'm going to speak specifically about the intersectionality, as I would say, or the relationship between ecocide and human rights impacts. And specifically, I'm going to speak about actually the work that was just mentioned, our land and environmental defenders work, and as well from the perspective of deforestation. So Global Witness is very much an investigative research organization that uses an evidence-based approach to campaign for systemic change. Since 2012, Global Witness has been gathering data on the killings of land and environmental defenders. And during the last 10 years, what the picture shows is grim, is that the evidence as the climate crisis intensifies, violence against land and environmental defenders also intensifies. And what is also becoming clear is that many of the killings that we have seen are actually connected to large-scale industrial activity, such as mining, as well as protection of forestry and forestry areas. In 2020, we recorded 227 lethal attacks, and that translates into more than 4 people a week, again, making that the most dangerous year on record. And as we see that we talked about, I mean, what our report actually captures is killings, but of course, you know, in addition to killings, we have criminalizations against defenders, we have other intimidation, we have violent attacks against land and environmental defenders. And from the point I'd like to make is that we live in a world where the reality is that the space, the civic space, the ability of communities and individuals to stand up for their land is actually shrinking. It is becoming more dangerous, from a human rights perspective. Often, as we will highlight later this year, because it's 10 years as we have been documenting these killings, we don't have accountability. So there isn't accountability often with respect to people who are in fact killed. And that's whether or not there's state involvement and or company involvement. But what we do know is that the prosecutions and investigations are low. The opportunity when we look at ecocide, as it's looking at from an environment and the severe and widespread harm to the environment, is that this is a complementary approach. And as we know year on year that we are documenting these the harms against people, what we also know is that the environment itself is deteriorating and very quickly, and often these individuals are being killed because they are protecting their local environment. And we often refer to them as being on the front line of the climate crisis. So yeah, I think that, this really shows quite clearly the intersectionality where there is large-scale human rights abuse. There's also this environmental harm. And, the routes to justice, they are relevant and complementary to each other. The second perspective I wanted to bring in was with respect to deforestation. We have a campaign that is specifically looking at wanting to end deforestation that's linked to, for example, beef, palm oil, these other activities that are happening in many tropical areas. We have specifically been looking at ways to regulate financial actors often located in the UK and Europe, in the United States, who are essentially financing these businesses that are directly causing deforestation. And of course, our research, what it shows is that, deforestation in these tropical areas, these are the carbon hotspots from a climate perspective, incredibly important. But we've also documented is that there are serious abuses to Indigenous peoples who are living in these areas and other communities that are seeking to defend their lands. So again, this shows that the two go hand in hand. If there was a crime of ecocide that could be pursued, this would have the additional benefit of not just protecting these areas from deforestation, but also protecting Indigenous people's livelihood rights, land rights, rights to food, rights to water. The last thing I wanted to highlight in as the current state of play is that, with respect to, let's say, agricultural companies and with respect to banks, particularly in deforestation, we have a lot of policies that companies implement or are failing to implement, but they create the policy, which are zero deforestation policies, for example. And often these policies, they're voluntary in nature. And even as our evidence has shown, companies are not actually following their zero deforestation policies, and in fact, either financing deforestation or engaging in it, there is no way to hold them to account currently. So while we are pursuing efforts within particular jurisdictions to have regulations in place, this offers another avenue, which would have the combined benefit of both saving the planet, as well as people who need to be protected the most. So thank you very much for having me on the panel, and I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Sima, for your overview of this dramatic issue of environmental defenders. If I may borrow from Andrea Krosta's convergence talking point, here we have a third type of family of convergence. He spoke about convergency from the perpetrator's view. I mentioned convergency from the enforcement community perspective, or within the enforcement community. And Sima brings convergence on the victim side. And here is the tragedy, because we see the protectors of the environment being killed, being threatened, their families at risk. And those are the people that, in fact, the legal system and the judicial system should be protecting the most. It's not an ecocide per se, but it should be an aggravated circumstances that increase the penalty of those victims. The final speaker is Richard Rogers, Partner, Global Diligence and Executive Director, Climate Council. Richard is an international criminal lawyer who has held senior positions in the United Nations and the OSCE, dealing with war crimes, human rights, and legal reform. He was the OSCE Chief Legal System Monitor in post-conflict Kosovo, the principal defender at the UN's Extraordinary Chamber in the Courts of Cambodia, and the head of the legal support for the Appeals Chamber at the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia. In 2016, Richard was hired by the Registrar of the International Criminal Court to review and overhaul the ICC's legal aid system. Richard was deputy co-chair of the independent expert panel for the legal definition of ecocide. He has provided advice on ecocide laws at the European Union level and to parliamentarians from several states at the national level. Richard, a great pleasure.
Thank you very much, Professor, for that introduction, and for Jojo for inviting me today. I'd first just like to make a point that really builds on what Andreas and Sima have said about how environmental crimes feed instability, conflict, and violence. And that is because they feed not only criminal gangs, but in some cases, they also prop up the violent kleptocratic dictatorships. And so we see that in some autocratic countries, state actors not only fail to tackle the problem of environmental crime, but they are central to the criminal enterprise itself. The ruling elite perpetrate, facilitate, and benefit from environmental crime. And so in fact, it seems like the single easiest way to make money if you're a kleptocratic dictator is to steal your country's natural resources. And we see a pattern where the ruling elite capture and configure a state apparatus. They work with organized criminal gangs to create networks. They grab land, they evict residents, and then they sell off the natural resources. And so the elite, they gain power to make money. That's the purpose. And then they use the money to maintain power. And that can go on for a long time. That's terrible for the environment, but it's also pretty bad for the civilian population, because very often people resist having their homes and land stolen from them. Land grabbing often turns violence. The state call in the army and the police to quell resistance. And we've seen shocking brutality in some cases. So basically, environmental crime very often bankrolls authoritarian regimes. And it's the lack of an international law criminalizing ecocide that creates that legal space for some dictators to function and to commit these human rights abuses. So looking at the definition, some people have actually said, well, do we really need a new international law? Can't we just use the ones that we have? Well, the short answer is yes, we can use the current ones, but only in very limited circumstances. Of the current 4 international crimes, there's only one provision that mentions the natural environment. That's a war crime, but war crimes can only be applied in armed conflict. So that's not much use in peacetime land grabbing, deforestation, pollution, etc. We can also use crimes against humanity, which doesn't require an armed conflict to be applicable, but none of the underlying crimes mention environmental destruction or require human suffering. So we can only use crimes against humanity to tackle environmental destruction when it's accompanied and associated with human harm. Most situations will be excluded. So we need a new crime that is ecocentric, that gives the natural environment a status and a standing before the law, irrespective of human harm. So let's look at the definition itself that was proposed by the expert panel. I'll read it again. Ecocide means unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. Now, the panel tried to create a definition that captured the worst offending conduct, but would not scare off states. So in other words, it's broad enough to be meaningful, but not too broad to undermine legitimate development. We had to be pragmatic because ultimately it's states that will decide whether ecocide should become a new international law. And it's important to understand that all international criminal law was designed to deal with the very worst cases, those mass harms that offend mankind generally. And ecocide should be no different. So the panel tried to keep states on board in a few ways. One, by applying 2 thresholds, which I will talk about in a minute. Another by using familiar language and concepts from international criminal law. Thirdly, by keeping it relatively simple. So, for example, not including a list of underlying crimes. So having a look at the 2 thresholds, the first relates to the scale and the nature of the harm, so the consequences. And we define this as severe and either widespread or long-term damage. So if damage is not severe, it's not ecocide, but it must also be either widespread or long-term. And we felt like that combination ensured that only the most serious types of environmental harm were captured. But this threshold alone could be problematic because it might capture actions that cause severe damage, but are nonetheless justified and lawful. Building housing to shelter poor people, roads to connect people, farms to feed people. So we wanted to narrow down the potential cases by adding another threshold. And the second threshold requires that the acts be unlawful or wanton. Unlawful is relatively straightforward. If it's illegal, you shouldn't do it. But if we only had unlawful, then states could legislate out of liability for themselves or their businesses, because most environmental crimes are found under national law. So we needed another possibility that could override the lawfulness. And that's where wanton comes in, which we define as acts done with reckless disregard for damage which will be clearly excessive in relation to the social and economic benefits anticipated. So that allows a court to weigh harm against benefits, and it conforms to principles of sustainable development and environmental law in many cases. And it takes account of the need for legitimate and lawful developments, even if they cause environmental harm. And we believe that that was key to keeping states on board, particularly developing countries. For the mental element, the mens rea, we used a recklessness standard. So that's knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of the consequences, which we felt was sufficiently but not overly strict. And finally, the definition was designed to stay relevant over time. So as we all know, environmental issues are moving fast in terms of science, technology, attitudes, behaviors. So what's acceptable today might not be acceptable tomorrow. And the phrase unlawful or wanton helps ensure that the definition can be interpreted progressively over time as expectations develop. So for example, as legal protections of the environment expand, then more acts will become unlawful and fall within the definition. And for the concept of wanton, society's ideas of harm versus benefit will evolve over time. So, for example, the benefits of coal, which drove our economies for 100 years or so, it was obviously beneficial, not so much these days. So finally, a few advantages of a new international crime of ecocide as opposed to civil law options or national crimes. Firstly, it would have very sharp teeth in the sense that as an international crime, it can lead to prosecution, prison, long sentences, etc. Secondly, that the net is very wide. So in terms of territory, it could cover crimes in 123 countries if all the ICC members signed up. In terms of who could be targeted, the immunity for heads of state and other persons in the ICC is very limited. And in terms of forms of liability, we could target not only those who directly commit the acts, but also those who are complicit. So, for example, those who aid and abet, possibly including funders. But perhaps most importantly, a new international crime of ecocide would have this enormous symbolic value. Criminal law has always been one of the best tools to influence behavior. The weight of moral condemnation helps to guide people, guide their actions, their omissions. With international criminal law, that weight is multiplied because nobody wants to be equivalent, seen as equivalent as a war criminal or to become some kind of pariah. So it's the combination of all those factors we hope that will lead to a change of consciousness and a change of behavior. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richard. We were expecting to have a few more minutes left, like 8 minutes, but unfortunately we have only 2 minutes left. Let me wrap up from my side this fantastic conversation. Well, first of all, as you all noticed, there is so much that still need to be discussed. Very short event, and I'm sure Jojo and her colleagues will be organizing a more in-depth conversation on this important issue. Second, that in discussing ecocide, we need to take the whole picture: the ethical, the ecological, the legal, and the pragmatic. And the pragmatic meaning that it will probably help having countries enacting or reforming their criminal laws and expressly giving an identity to this type of behavior that we call ecocide. And also within the enforcement community to make sure that even if it's not in the legal books yet, the concept itself resonates with already traditional criminal provisions that we have. It's a new reading as well, or could be a new reading in the meantime of the crimes against the environment that we have in our legal system, nationally and subnationally. My very last point is about dreaming. Law is also about dreaming. We would have no good laws if we didn't have those that can think well beyond what the law is, and able to criticize, but at the same time to recognize that there are other possibilities. That's evolution, that's progress in law as well. So many thanks to all the panelists, and I will ask Jojo Mehta to do the official closing.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all our co-hosts. Thank you to our amazing speakers. And thank you to all of our team across the world. And also, of course, to our wonderful audience today. And very much looking forward to more in-depth conversations around this subject with all of you. Thank you so much. Have a great day.